We have our dispersion variant. However, we are not handling any attributes related to this variant. If you ever looked into Fabric API and, for example, the Fluid API, you will see that we have some attributes related to this fluid type and fluid variant that the API handles them, like when they should play a filling sound or emptying sound and things like that. In this video, we will handle them. Hello everyone, this is Alireza. Welcome to the Mentor Code Lab. To begin with, if you notice, I have added two packages for the interface and the records under the base because things will become busier as we go forward, and having organization like this is useful. So we will start with an interface and we will call it Dispersion Variant Attribute Handler. And yes, it's a long name. However, we can't change it as we want. This interface will have a component, and if you recall, this is called text in Yarn. So component, and we call it getName, and this getName will use the dispersion variant, and we call it variant. Then we want a default that returns optional of the sound event. We need to import a class for the optional from Java utils, and that is called getField sound. For the dispersion variant, we call it variant. By default, we want to return the optional.empty. So we don't have any sound for filling this dispersion into any container. I will copy all of that, I will paste it, and this is get empty sound. And again, we return an optional empty. Now we want a class, and I will put it under the base. We call it dispersion variant attributes. Now this is a final class, and few of other classes should be called final, but I will do that behind the scenes because I need to sit back and think about which class should be final. Basically, a class that is final cannot be changed or implemented in any other shape. I need to sit back and think about that. API provider map. Here we want a dispersion and the attribute holder. So this is dispersion variant attribute holder. As you see, I typed the lowercase I capital characters for the start of the name. So I found that one. And we call it handlers equals to API provider map dot create. The next one is a private static final dispersion variant attribute handler, and we call it default handler equals to. Now I want to use a lambda here because this is actually an instance of a class. So we say dispersion variant goes into, and then let's close this with a semicolon. Here we say holder of dispersion registry entry equals to the dispersion variant dot type holder. Then we say if the registry entry dot onward key dot is present. Basically, if we found anything, then we want an identifier. We call it ID equals to the registry entry dot onward key dot get dot identifier. Then we return a component. If I can find it, the translatable, I can. So component dot translatable, and here we want to define a key. Here is dispersion dot then plus id dot get namespace plus another dot plus id dot get path. What do we have here is a key that will be, for example, dispersion dot new era dot, I don't know, some dispersion type, and that is our key. So we need to handle that key later in our language file. And after this if block, we finally return a component dot translatable of dispersion dot plus we want the dispersion API dot mod ID comma dot unknown. Means that we didn't find any dispersion here. So basically it will be, for example, dispersion dot unknown based on what we called for the mod ID, and this is dispersion API. That's okay. Then I will add a method that I normally don't calling it myself, but it is there for the sake of completeness, and that is public static returns nothing, void register. This one is asking for a dispersion, we call it dispersion, and then a dispersion attribute handler, and we call it handler. We simply check if the handlers dot put if absent. Basically, if we don't have this handler in the system, then add it. After this, we need a method that will be used in our mods when we want to register a new handler into the system. So we say public static void, and we call it register. This one is asking for a dispenser, and then dispenser variant attribute handler. We call it handler. Well, we want to put it inside handlers. So we say handlers dot put if absent. We want the dispenser and the handler. So it returns a V or a type of the handler that we can check it. So we say if. What we want to do is to check if we did put something in the system or not. If this thing put if absent returns something, that it means that we could add it to the system. But if it returns null, it means that the handler was already in the system and we did nothing. So we both check if it's equals to null, then we want to throw a new illegal argument exception. And what's wrong with you? It says is always false. If I negate it, it says remove it because it's always true. Let me see. Handlers dot. I didn't generate sources, so I don't have Java docs. But we have this get dispersion that returns dispersion handler. So I can check if we have the dispersion. I can check if this guy does not equal to null, throw new illegal argument exception, duplicate handler registration for dispersion plus dispersion. So now I can remove this part and we just put it inside the system if it's absent. Basically, I could ignore the whole thing and say put if absent. If it was not absent, then well, it would ignore the whole thing. However, I wouldn't know if I'm trying to register something double time. So having this little sanity check helps. This wouldn't cause an error. However, my code would be bizarre. So having this sanity check is preventing me from doing something stupid as registering a handler twice. The next one is to get the handler. So we say get handler, and it's not smart enough to add everything for me. So public static, it returns a dispersion attribute handler, and we call it get handler for the dispersion. Here we say return the handlers dot get the dispersion. Then we want a public static dispersion attribute handler, and we call it get handler or default for the dispersion. Here we say dispersion attribute handler equals to the handlers dot get for the dispersion. Now remember, this guy can be nullable, so let's annotate that one. This could be a method call for myself. However, in this case, it's not a big deal. It's just a method call being layered on top of a method call. So why do we do that if we can directly access it? Then we want to check if the handler does not equal null. Then we want to return the handler. Otherwise, we want to return the default handler. Finally, we want the methods that we want to override when we are having this thing: the get name, the get field sound, or get empty sound. We say public static returns a component, and that is get name for the dispersion variant, and we call it variant. In this case, we return get handler or default for the variant dot get dispersion. And now that we have the handler, we simply say dot get name for dispersion variant, or here I called it variant. So as you see, we call the handler, and on top of the handler, we send in the variant, get the name out of it. Then we say public static sound event, and this is get field sound for the dispersion variant. We call it variant. Return again the whole thing for getting the variant or the default one. dot get field sound for the variant, but this can be an optional that is empty. So at the end we say dot or. We want to give it a supplier that is an empty supplier variant dot get dispersion get pickup sound. It's not there. We will take a look at that later. However, at the end dot or else means that if everything failed, we want the sound events dot bucket empty. Actually, I think I want to change these to a little bit here. I have the variant. First of all, this should be fill sound, not field. Then I have this variant and I want a nullable item and we call it item in both cases. It can be null, it doesn't harm anyone. However, now I have the ability to change these things. Let me remove everything. After getting this, we call get fill sound on the variant, an item that we don't have yet. And if it failed or else, at the very end, we want the sound events dot bucket empty. Now this item is not there. I need to add it. So it is again a nullable item. We call it item. The last one, public static sound event, and that is get empty sound. Again, we will have the same thing. Actually, this one should be item bucket fill. Okay. This is the whole copy pasting process because the only thing that is changing is the sound will be the empty one. Okay, and here we will call the empty sound. If it fails, then we have the bucket empty sound, so we can use that one. Now, you may wonder, we have this interface. Couldn't we implement that interface here and then have overrides here? No, this is an API design that make people confused. Basically, we have a class that is not type bound to the interface. However, we will have some attributes in any mod that is implementing this type. This one is related to registering a handler into the system. And then whenever we want, we can use the handler and call the methods on the handler. Remember, any class that implements this interface will become a handler, not the attributes instance, because the attributes is a cumulative collection of these handlers, and we can't implement the interface directly here. The only reason that we have these methods with the same names is to make your life as the user of the library easier, because you don't need to remember two different names for the method calls so that everything works. This way we have an easier thing and we say that, okay, you know what? We have get name everywhere. So if I want something and I forgot what was the name, put a get as a method name and I see get name, get fill, and get empty. Okay, I know what's going on here. However, these are not the implementations of an attribute handler. Anyway, that's the two classes being implemented. From the next video, we need to sit back and think about a very confusing and big complex decision making, because before we start the storage, we need to think about how we can use this system. Actually, Olama that I showed in the first video has suggested some things, and I need to compare them to what we have right now and think about how we can utilize those, or maybe we drop those things, but we get the ideas and implement our things.